My name is Tom Behrens. As was mentioned, I'm a planner with Burgess Associates. Our firm was retained to prepare a new land use ordinance for the city. The task, as I understand it, was essentially to streamline and modernize the existing development regulations ordinance and implement the 2016 master plan goals and objectives, as was just mentioned. The development regulations ordinance itself generally sets forth the administrative procedures for development review, including board duties and powers, and regulates uses and physical development within the city. The last comprehensive development ordinance was adopted on December 2nd, 2003, which is about 16 years ago. The world has changed quite a bit since then. Just to go back in time a bit, George W. Bush was serving his first term in office. We were about 4 years from entering the Great Recession, which is significant in this context, given the changes that have occurred to land use since then. Pirates of the Caribbean was a blockbuster hit at the time, and Facebook would launch the following year. So given the changes in our society, market trends and preferences, it's been determined by the city that there's a need for reviewing and updating its development regulations. So tonight I just wanted to give a presentation to go over the process in terms of implementing the ordinance and some notable changes moving forward in advance of hopefully adopting the ordinance on November 6th of this year. To date, we have gotten a significant amount of feedback. We held a number of stakeholder meetings with local engineers, architects, developers, real estate experts, and about 3 stakeholder meetings early on in the process. We've had a subcommittee meeting, or subcommittee rather, with members of the planning board. We've met with the planning board on several occasions. We've discussed some of the issues with Council President Nadeau and Councilwoman Fox. And we've also gotten input from the city staff, and in general have just poured over every word and phrase to try to get this through. So with that, the municipal land use law recognizes that municipalities change over time, and as such, the MLUL requires a recommendation, or re-examination rather, of the master plan at least every 10 years. The master plan establishes the land use policies, goals, and objectives. The zoning ordinance implements the master plan with specific use and development regulations. The municipal land use law establishes the process in implementing a zoning ordinance, which begins with the adoption of a master plan, which the city undertook in 2016. The next step would be the planning board preparing a draft ordinance, which we've been working on a draft, and the board plans to review on October 28th. The planning board then will refer the ordinance to the governing body. The introduction of the ordinance by the governing body would be the next step, and then it is referred back to the planning board for a master plan consistency review, and then the governing body will finally adopt the ordinance and the regulations will become law. In terms of the schedule moving forward, as I mentioned, the planning board will review the draft ordinance on October 28th. The governing body will introduce the ordinance on November 6th. The planning board will conduct its master plan consistency review on November 25th. And the governing body will adopt the ordinance, will hopefully adopt the ordinance on December 3rd. That's the game. So in working on the regulations and updating the regulations, we've been guided by a number of principles, including probably most significantly the implementation of the 2016 master plan revision. The zoning board has also given us some comments in its annual report about significant issues or issues that have come up time and time again that they'd like us to review and incorporate into the ordinance. Again, the effort is to streamline and modernize the existing ordinance, create regulations that strengthen local assets, address emerging land use issues, refine and expand upon existing design criteria, and promote sustainable development, among other principles. The 2016 master plan revision has 6 primary goals, including goal number 1, to guide development, to maintain and enhance the character of Summit. Goal 2, to maintain a dynamic and vibrant city. Goal 3, to improve connectivity between people and places to promote a healthy and vibrant community. Goal 4, to promote a city that is welcoming to residents of all ages, races, ethnicities, abilities, and income ranges. And Goal 5, to build economic resiliency by supporting reinvestment. And Goal 6, preserve and enhance natural beauty, open space, and community facility assets for future generations. So I'm not going to list all these specific objectives that we're advancing, but I'll go over a few that go beyond those 6 primary goals. They include the objective of strengthening design standards and guidelines, which has been an emphasis of this effort, protecting existing sites that are of historic value to preserve the city's historic character, maintain the prevailing character of neighborhoods, promote clear, user-friendly, and transparent application, review, and public hearing process for development proposals and applications. And just a few more: to promote mixed use and residential development downtown, develop consistent facades, storefront, and signage standards and guidelines, and encourage low-impact development and green technologies in all new and existing buildings, infrastructure, and capital projects. As I mentioned, our effort in part was to streamline the ordinance. So as proposed, we've reorganized the ordinance into 5 main parts with a number of appendices, and the structure itself is intended to consolidate existing sections of the ordinance. We kept what works, and there is a lot of what works. There's a good system, but we thought we could expand upon it. We eliminated what doesn't work, and we refined and expanded other sections as needed. So Part 1, General Provisions and Administration, basically gets into the administration of the development review process, and again, Planning Board and Zoning Board powers and duties. The zoning generally covers all of the use and physical regulations of the city. Stormwater management and drainage covers most of the engineering aspects of the ordinance. Environmentally sensitive areas talks about steep slopes, floodplain regulations and wetlands, and then we have historic preservation. And the appendix will include the zoning map, application checklists, use and bulk schedules, and some design guidelines. And again, in the effort to streamline the ordinance, we've addressed inconsistencies, clarified language, consolidated related provisions as needed, review the applicability of current regulations, remedy flawed provisions, and in general try to make it more user-friendly so the people could review it and know what to do without having too much bouncing around. With regard to strengthening local assets, we've reviewed every single zone and tried to expand upon the list of permitted uses in each zone. Over on the right, you'll see a picture of a brewery. I think it's been determined that uses like this, including wineries, microbreweries, and uses that have a little more entertainment value, are desired in the city in appropriate locations, of course. And other uses that aren't currently permitted include self-storage and urgent care, for example. We also intend to promote economic development, design criteria to protect and enhance the character of the city, prevent demolition of the city's about 30-something historic landmarks, encourage green building best practices to conserve energy, water, and materials, reduce runoff, mitigate the urban heat island effect, and decrease carbon emissions, among other goals. In terms of addressing emerging land uses, just for example, we've addressed definitions and standards for new uses. Again, we've included new permitted uses. We've tried to address rooftop amenities and uses as they seem to be gaining in popularity. And again, green building strategies, standards, and incentives. And below, you'll see a building that was recently constructed at 40 Beechwood Avenue, which includes rooftop amenities and is an office building. It is one of the newest buildings in the city. Based on the stakeholder meetings that I mentioned earlier and input from the community in general, but also from architects and design professionals, there was a desire to create some level of flexibility in terms of improving single-family homes in certain districts, and specifically those in the R25 and R43 zones, which tend to have some larger and taller homes and can't necessarily adhere to let's say the height limitations, for instance, within the zone. So one of the ideas was to increase the permitted height to a maximum, slightly above the maximum permitted height with the caveat of having a minimum roof pitch. This way, the design would be able to be achieved, but in a way that would also give those homeowners flexibility to do something that was consistent with what exists on the property and within the neighborhood. And in all zones, we propose that additions may match existing roof lines based on, again, with limitation, based on feedback from the design community. Some other design parameters specific to single-family and two-family homes include flat roofs limited to 20% of what we're calling lower-tier roofs, as you can see on the picture on the left, essentially a one-story portion or that area less than the main roof or the highest point of the roof. And that all roofs in the R zones primarily would have a minimum roof pitch of about 612, or at least 80% of the roof coverage. And the idea would be to discourage a more modern type of home, which you can see on the right, which, I mean, design's subjective. Some might think that that is an attractive home. Not saying that it's not, but if you were to ask someone if that matches the character of Summit as it is today, one might think that it may not. So these provisions are intended to address that and, again, encourage development that is consistent with the existing housing stock. Another provision, though it may sound simple, is requiring the primary entrance to dwellings on the street that contains the street's address. And again, it's just to establish uniformity and be consistent with the existing character of the city. One issue that's come up is to discourage essentially garages taking over the front or the character of the home in general. And you can see two examples, one where sort of a snout design, as it's referred to, where the garage projects way in front of the existing front plane of the house and basically takes over and establishes itself as the predominant feature of the dwelling. And on the other side, you see another, not a front-oriented garage, but a side-oriented garage, which establishes basically a parking courtyard in the front, which encourages impervious coverage in the front yard, and again takes away from the character of the home, which would tend to be inconsistent with the city's current housing stock. Here's a local example that does have a front-facing garage, which does project a bit in front of the house, but seems to meet the objectives of the city from a design perspective. And so we've tried to tailor the design requirements to allow for some level of projection, but in a way that can be done that, again, meets the design goals of the city and can be done in a way that's consistent with the character of the neighborhoods in the city. This is another example of a front-facing garage. What we've proposed is to increase the allowance for where front-facing garages can be permitted. Currently, they're only permitted on lots up to 75 feet in width. We're proposing that that be increased to 90 feet, and what that does is now include homes in the R10 zone, which have a minimum lot width of 75 feet. So again, it's not 90 feet, it's lots less than 90 feet. The R15 zone requires lots of minimally 90 feet. So it would be the R10 zone and zones with smaller lot conditions, typically. And there would be a maximum of a two-car garage limit and a maximum width of 24 feet, again, to avoid having the garage become the dominant feature of the home as observed from the street. We did address design requirements for other types of homes. I'm just not going to get into the details tonight. For townhouses, multifamily development, mixed-use development, non-residential development, and supplementary regulations by zone as warranted. These design requirements, just in generalities, include building mass and form, fenestration, storefronts, building articulation, parking structures, and signs. With regard to sustainability, which I understand the city's been trying to emphasize and was addressed pretty significantly in the master plan, so we've tried to incorporate that the best we could into the zoning ordinance, and again, in an effort to modernize the ordinance. We've taken a multifaceted approach, which includes the removal of barriers from implementation, create standards and definitions for green building strategies, and create development bonus incentives for green building strategies. So in terms of removing barriers, we're now permitting green building technology as permitted accessory uses where, for example, solar panels are not permitted today. So depending on where they're proposed, they may require variance relief. We're trying to make it an easier process for people to incorporate these types of technologies. Green roofs would be another type of technology, and having standards for these individual strategies. So just to go over a few of them, we have electrical vehicle charging stations, which there's a retail component where basically people will take or occupy a few parking spaces in, let's say, a commercial lot, a Target. I know there's no Target in Summit, but they might occupy 6 to 10 spaces and actually charge people to come and use those as an accessory component of the primary user of the site. We're also encouraging or requiring a certain number of electrical vehicle charging stations on most, if not all, non-residential sites, and also providing parameters for residential and mixed-use development. Solar panel systems would be another strategy, and we've created standards for solar canopies, so those that you see above parking areas, above walkways that are generally projected, not projected, but create sort of a roof or a canopy, as the term implies. Standards for flat roofs, sloped roofs such as single-family homes, and ground-mounted panels, which would be limited to certain zones where space would allow. We're requiring reflective roofing in certain zones on flat roofs. You can see a picture of what's referred to as a cool roof, and basically has a lot to do with the color, in that it's of a reflective quality that instead of absorbing the heat, it essentially reflects the heat. And if you have a number of buildings that do this, you can substantially reduce what's known as the urban heat island effect, which tends to, as the image on the left indicates, downtown and urban areas tend to absorb more heat and generate more heat, and are typically have higher temperatures than surrounding areas in the summer months. Another strategy would be green stormwater infrastructure, so basically creating planting systems around parking areas to absorb water and reduce runoff, and we've created standards for this type of strategy. And green roofs would be another one. So these are roofs that almost function like the ground in terms of that they absorb and hold the water, as opposed to just running down a downspout and entering the city's stormwater drain. In terms of sustainable bonus incentives, we have a few approaches to this, and based on our research, what many municipalities use as a standard are LEED standards or equivalent, and they have 4 different levels as shown. I don't want to say the easiest to achieve, but the one that requires the fewest points is the certified level, which requires 40 to 49 points. We're focusing more on the silver, gold, and platinum levels. So the idea would be that if you were to achieve one of those levels and demonstrate that you would have some type of bonus, whether it be an FAR, floor area ratio bonus, density bonus, or perhaps in the case of platinum, maybe even a height bonus of a story, depending on the location. And the thought, as we've discussed with members of the planning board internally, was to have a flexible process where a developer may not necessarily be granted a certain incentive, but that there would be flexibility that would match the type of the program or strategy that was being offered with a cap. And just to cover a few other bonus incentives, they include measures for recycling, reusing water, green stormwater infrastructure, installing solar panels, green roofs, reduced energy consumption, and in Cranford, they have a strategy where developers can basically offer or request an incentive. That seemed to be like an interesting approach where, again, if the developer can demonstrate that the bonus being requested that's tailored to the specific project adheres to a certain goal or strategy, that might be something worth entertaining. So again, tonight my intent was to go over the process and just hit some highlights of what we've tried to address and some of the major changes in the ordinance. The ordinance itself is a living document intended to evolve over time, and we do recommend that after it is adopted that the city in general just conduct some sort of review just to make sure it stays on track and to address anything that needs to be addressed.
Thank you very much, Tom. Just wait there because we'll take questions from members of council, then I'll open it up to the public if they have questions and if there's any further discussion by members of council with you. I just also want to just acknowledge that obviously there's been, people in the city staff that have been involved in this process. Paul, Aaron, Rick, all those guys have been, Chris, Krista, everybody's been really involved. This has been a very intensive process. And then, of course, there's all the other members of the planning board who have been involved in this process. I mean, this has evolved over the last 2 years, and so there's been a lot of people who have given their input to it. So thank you to everyone for all their hard work in getting us to where we are today. As you said, this is, in a way, looking at something that's kind of been there for 16 years. They've been adding on. And one of the biggest complaints that people had is, this is a document, as it was, sometimes hard to follow, sometimes inconsistent, required a lot of effort. We're trying to make sure that people get a document at the end of the day that's easier to understand. Obviously, there's some rules and regulations that are just what they are. They're state mandated, and they're written the way that they are, but trying to do that. And the other aspect that I think is important, as you highlighted here, is the design and the sustainability elements that are not currently there in the document, but that will be hopefully in the future documents, because those were key elements of what the master plan process, is my recollection, of both on the planning board as well as sitting in the workshops that people in this town wanted. And since we had a lot of public input, we know this is something that's derived from not simply a few people sitting in a room, but rather a community-wide effort. So thanks to all of you guys for all the hard work. With that, I'm going to open it up to members of council who want to have specific questions of the mayor. Anybody before I ask the public? Everybody's silent here. Okay. Maybe if there's people in the public that want to ask questions, we can then see if members of council have other questions to ask. Anybody from the public want to start us up? Wow, okay. Claire, come on up. Yeah, there you go.
Hi, Claire Toth, T-O-T-H, 11 Sunset Drive. I'll note that I sit on both the Historic Preservation Commission and Summit Downtown, neither of which was invited to be involved in this process. So I am curious about additional opportunities for public input on this, and when, or is this document going to be publicly available so that we can review it and comment on it well in advance of the December adoption meeting? Thank you.
Thank you, Claire. Okay, so either Tom or Bill, one of you guys want to address those?
I'll take a stab at it.
Okay.
So with regard to historic preservation, it's an issue that I think the city is still working through. We do intend to include a provision that prohibits demolition of landmarks while the city is working through that. And as I mentioned, we have a section in the ordinance specifically dedicated to historic preservation. So I think in the near future, probably in the coming months, we can resolve and have an ordinance specifically tailored to whatever is agreed upon in terms of historic preservation. And in terms of when a draft can become available, we are discussing what we'll call sort of a final draft with the planning board on October 28th. The ordinance is being introduced on November 6th, so I mean, maybe sometime after introduction or at introduction. It could be made possibly sooner, depending on input received from the planning board.
But you have had, am I mistaken, and Marjorie, you said on the planning board, but my recollection is that you guys have had public discussion of components of this of this document, correct?
That's absolutely correct.
Why don't you explain what
Well,
a little
we've
bit more?
had, I think probably Bill can do a better job of it because I've only been on the planning board for this calendar year. But we've had a number of discussions at meetings of different sections, and in our last meeting, we dedicated the entire meeting to a discussion of all the various provisions and the concerns that different members of the planning board had with provisions of the document. So I think there's certainly been an opportunity for the public to speak up in that regard and also to hear the discussion.
Right, okay. Bill, do you want to come up?
Yeah, please jump in if I missed something, Bill.
Bill Anderson, 22 Cromwell Parkway, Summit High School, class of 69. Planning Board Chair. With regard to historic preservation, we met with Melissa a number of times, and Tom has been involved. It became complicated and more detailed, and we felt we really wanted to spend the proper amount of time on it and didn't want to sort of jam it through this process. We felt that the zoning aspects of it were so outdated that they need to be moved forward. So we said the best thing to do is to take the time we need with historic preservation and get it right. But one of the things that we did want to address with regard to historic preservation was the fact that essentially there's no virtual review of any of the 35 or 38 historic buildings that are mentioned in the 2004 Historic Preservation Report still left available. And one essentially can, I guess, apply for a permit, knock it down, and there's no review or anything to deal with that. So one of the things that we will have in this document will be some review required with regard to tearing down existing historic structures. And then we need to take more time with the other aspects of historic preservation, to make sure we get the details correct on that.
And let me just add about the point about the demolition and having a review of the historic preservation, buildings that are on the list of historic buildings. This was something that the Historic Preservation Committee, when they came to council back last year, was one of the primary things that they wanted us as a council to address, because the concern was that there's nothing right now, that if you have a building that's listed on what is the historical registry, if you will, of Summit, if you wanted to go ahead, you don't need a variance. If you don't need to go before the zoning board or the planning board for some reason, you just want to knock it down, there is no review process. And I think this is one of those things that addresses one of the concerns the Historic Preservation Committee had from last year's discussion.
Okay.
So thank you, Bill. The other point that Claire made, and I wanted this addressed as well, if you could, is downtown SDI. Most of this stuff, as far as downtown, is not going to make an impact, right? I mean, we already have a fully built downtown. Is it going to make a significant impact?
I don't know if it'll impact the function of the SDI per se. We are refining the requirements of the CRBD and surround, the entire city, for that matter. But we are implementing the 2016 master plan, which I believe had significant input from community and variety of committees and public participation.
And stakeholders, including the SDI.
Stakeholders, correct.
Nora.
And I think with SDI's input, earlier this year, council approved a revised ordinance regarding permitted uses on the ground floor.
Correct.
And we did that before we got the DRO, because within SDI's input, we wanted to enact that sooner rather than later, rather than waiting for this whole DRO process. So SDI's input has been taken account of.
Thank you, Nora. Anybody else have public comments or questions? Okay. Any now members of council? Maybe this is stimulated, but if not, it's fine. We're going to have another chance at this, to look at this in detail when the documents come in front of us. The planning board, I would encourage people who are interested in this, who haven't had a chance, as Councilwoman Fox said, the planning board has discussed a lot of this in detail for many, many hours. And those are on Hometown TV in the archive. So if you want to watch, you can get a flavor of all the back and forth, because there is a lot of different opinions that a document like this. And one of the things I think I will say about my former colleagues on the planning board, none of them are shy to express their opinions, and they have a variety of opinions. And so when you have the planning board come to a consensus for a document, that's one of the good things about the planning board. You have a lot of people who are very smart and intelligent, who have ideas, but when they come together from a variety of perspectives, you have a pretty good sense of where the community is. So thank you to them, thank you to our city staff, thank you, Tom, and with that, oh wait, Mike, after my entire wrap-up. Come on.
Your comments stimulated the brain cells.
Okay, fine, there you go.
No, I just wouldn't, just listening to the commentary, I guess I am very much looking forward to looking through the document and our discussion about it in a couple of weeks. But I guess one of the things, just based off what you said, maybe you can clarify a little bit, or perhaps it'll be in the document, but this idea of these trade-offs for possibly, I guess my bigger focus would be on density, for instance, versus adding these green elements, I suppose. The place where that's mostly going to happen, I would assume, would be in the downtown area, because that's where, we have, or perhaps I'm wrong, but where we're thinking about development and adding density. I guess my concern is obviously, I completely agree with what Council President Naidu said, that the master plan had, a lot of people talking about these initiatives. But on the flip side, I got loud and clear that we don't want to change the character of the downtown. We don't want this to be, I'm sorry, Michael, a Morristown, for instance.
I completely agree with you.
Yeah, so I guess I worry whenever we add some of this horse trading ability, whether, we might, for some, I guess, goal, we lose sight of the forest, I guess. And so I'm very much interested to hear how that process is going to be and how people will weigh that, because I do think, we have to understand, like, people love our downtown. We love the look of it. Sure. And we talk about this all the time when we're talking about the Broad Street West. Developers want density. I get it. But there's a lot of reasons why maybe others may not feel the same way.
Well said, and I appreciate that. And I probably should have clarified a few points about that. One would be that these incentives would not be applicable to single and two-family homes. So you wouldn't be able to build a bigger house because you put up solar panels. I mean, you would have other types of savings and be commended for that, but you wouldn't be entitled to have a bigger house. The CRBD certainly would be a focus. In terms of an incentive for the CRBD, I think they don't actually have a density parameter, but there are other bulk standards, for instance, like coverage, height's another one. I understand there's also sensitivity about going above and beyond the 3 stories. So the thought was that, except in perhaps an exceptional circumstance, like a 100-point platinum LEED rated project, that maybe that would be an occasion to go up to 4 stories, maybe. But we would look to other bulk parameters other than density, including FAR and improved lot coverage in terms of how to incentivize that type of development. The incentives would be applicable to other, let's say, multifamily and non-residential zones, so like the LI zone, for instance. They might get some more FAR there, for instance. Density wouldn't apply because it would be a non-residential type of development. And so I completely agree that the bonus would have to be consistent with the type of strategy and the level that's being provided. We've discussed on a preliminary basis what those incentives should be, but I think we'll get into it and try to finalize it at the planning board meeting, as it's been an evolving topic.
Tom, let me ask
meeting
you
on the
this, let me just follow up this question so we should have a more specific answer. When you say that there's these bonuses, does that automatically kick in, or is there some review process by some board or council that then would make a determination that, okay, you got to, let's say, platinum LEED, in exchange for that, we will give you this. Is this an automatic system, or is there some kind of review process, which goes to Councilman McTiernan's point, because you may say, well, that's great, you have this, but that building looks totally out of character, it looks different, whatever, and you weigh those equities, if you will, about it.
Sure. So there's 2 ways to go about it. So one would be the absolute way that if you achieve platinum, you get 10 extra units per acre. I think the desire and the feedback that we've gotten is to have a flexible review process where the reviewing entity, such as the planning board, would determine that the bonus is appropriate. So that's the approach that we're taking. So to give you an example, let's say if a building in the MF zone, the multifamily zone, achieved a silver rating, they might get a density of up to 2.5 units per acre, which would be at the discretion of the reviewing entity.
Okay, thank you.
So there'd be a range.
Okay. All right, anyone else? Okay. With that, thank you, Tom.